Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started here. I don't want to waste too much of your time here. I don't have a lot to go through today. First of all, the four of you for waking up this morning, thank you so much. The rest are going to have to answer a pretty direct email as to why seniors can't get up by 9 in the morning. Um, anyway, today for African American history, what we're going to focus on is the intro of Stamped. And the intro to Stamped, hopefully you read it. That was really the only homework, and that will be kind of the predominant homework is just reading just a few pages of that book so that we can have discussions of it moving forward. Um, so again, hopefully you read through it. Hopefully you kind of understood what the context was, and we're going to kind of get to that here in a second. But I did want to raise the results of the questionnaire I gave you, uh, the Google form that you filled out last week. Most of the people who filled it out, and it was the vast majority of the people in the course, were at least saying they were interested in history, or at least this specific version of history. So that's a good start. They did say that you collectively said that you weren't necessarily all that excited about history on the whole, which I totally understand. The way history is normally taught, it's very Eurocentric, as it's known, which means it focuses on Europe first and descendants from Europe. So obviously, if you are in any way a minority, and all of you on this call right now are female, you tend to get the back seat of historical record. And so I can understand why maybe that isn't all that intriguing to you, because when you're looking at the history books, the people that you're studying and the events that you're looking at were predominantly white men. So we'll definitely focus a little bit more. And I don't want to make this course kind of the way we treat Black History Month, which is coming up next week. We too many times when we hit Black History Month, everybody treats it as if it's some cutesy little event. It's not a cutesy little event. It's part of our history on a collective, and needs to be studied instead of just fun little facts here and there. So this course isn't going to be that. It's going to be a more in-depth look at not just the history, but also kind of where we are as a nation. So um, most of you said that you had at least a pretty functional knowledge of African American history, but again, that sometimes we just scrape the surface. So we're going to go a little bit more in depth. Of the people that the questionnaire kind of came up with, a lot of people tended to be interested in people like Malcolm X and Frederick Douglass. So obviously, the civil rights leaders had a great amount of sway there. There are a number of people that kind of wanted to study Obama and Obama's term of office. Rosa Parks came up, Harriet Tubman, Maya Angelou, Sojourner Truth. So there are writers, there are civil rights leaders in their own rights, but all women. So that's a good sign that we were interested in women. Somebody brought up Shirley Chisholm, who was a politician and one of the first females to ever declare for the presidency when she was I believe, member of the House of Representatives. Florence Griffith Joyner, who was a track star, but also kind of had some impact in society and some of the things she said and some of the views that she had. And there were some other interesting folks like George Floyd and Carter Woodson. So they're looking at kind of movements started by the unfortunate passing of George Floyd, and then of course the mindset of a let's be honest, African American philosopher in Woodson. So I like the fact that it wasn't just a long list of like, oh, I want to learn more about MLK. And while MLK is very important, he does tend to get the vast majority of the treatment in regular American history, and we tend to gloss over people. So we're going to be focusing in on some pretty interesting individuals. I think one of the most overlooked people of the 1960s was Stokely Carmichael, my personal opinion, but I think he gets short shrift when it comes to the Black Power movement and what eventually grows into the Black Panthers. So we're going to be kind of looking at some people that don't normally get some serious play during regular American history. And I'm going to certainly make arguments that some of these people do deserve to have more play. Events, you kind of all surprised me with running the gamut from obviously the more the more modern issue with George Floyd that I just mentioned and Black Lives Matter, police brutality. That was kind of coming up as a common theme. But a lot of people were saying, hey, I want to know more a little bit about Jim Crow. I want to know about the formation of the NAACP, what the Underground Railroad really did, what Freedom Summer was, and how it was inspired. And of course, unfortunately, the negatives that went along with it as well. Looking at historically Black colleges, Black Wall Street. You know, there was somebody who wanted to get into the anti-marriage laws, and absolutely, we're going to try our best to kind of fit these in and do little vignettes to make sure that everything that you wanted to learn from this course is somehow fit into this course as best I can. The time periods varied. Nobody was really, I thought for sure a number of you would say, oh, I want to focus on the, you know, more modern, or I want to focus more on this. There were people saying, hey, I want to know a little bit about colonies and how it started back then. So that's a good thing that we're kind of interested in a wide variety of time frames. Most people did say they wanted to at least kind of mix in some current events here and there. So we'll certainly do that. And there were kind of varying amounts of comfort when it came to sharing opinions. I get that. We're going to come up with ways for you to share opinions without having to talk in front of everybody on a Zoom call. But I also want to give the opportunity for you to do a Q&A, or, you know, reach out or possibly do some small groups if we start getting better participation in our Zoom calls. And then most of you said you were pretty strong readers. So, and most of you said you were looking forward to kind of doing the coursework, and the assignments that kind of varied. The one constant is most of you said kind of limit the writing. You didn't want to do a tremendous amount of writing. So we still will do writing. It's part of the skill set that needs to be taught in the social studies, but I promise to kind of limit that as well. I realize as the vast majority of you are seniors, you're probably not wanting to write massive research papers or anything like that before you leave the hallowed halls of Northwest, or at least the hallowed halls of Zoom. So when it came to Stamped and reading the introduction, were there any of you, and you can feel comfortable to unmute or just use the chat, were there any questions or reactions to what you read and what not just Kendi, but Reynolds were saying in the intro? And it was really Kendi who's saying it. Reynolds is the one that's going to kind of take over and summarize here. But what Ibram Kendi was talking about in anything he put out there. Okay, either three things are true. One, you're typing. Two, you're not actually in front of the computer because I can't see anybody, of course. And three, you're just anticipating other people taking the lead. I guess the fourth is also an opportunity or possibility that you maybe didn't have a chance to read it. Okay, so what I would like from now on, this to be a little bit more interactive, where you're typing into the chat or at least unmuting the mic and kind of saying something. All right, so Ms. Bell, thank you. I read it earlier yesterday, and I read it when I got up this morning to refresh. Okay, so do we understand his mentality, at least? And the main thing to get out of the introduction, because it's going to set the tone for the rest of the book, is his differentiation between three solid groups. He said in there that there are three groups of people, and he groups them into segregationists, assimilationists, and anti-racists. Okay. And this is important to understand because this is a view of history. This is his perspective. And it doesn't have to be your perspective. You can certainly argue it. You can certainly say, you know, I think he's a little off. I think he's too simplistic, or I think he's overblowing it a bit. You know, you can go any direction you want. That's the beauty of history. It's a discussion. Okay. But he basically puts them into three groups. All right. And the three groups you need to understand: segregationists are the people that believe that races need to be separated, that races should not interact or should have limited contact. These are the people that would maybe say, and he's even, if you read Stamped from the Beginning, his actual bigger book, he makes arguments that this could be as blatant as somebody that is in the Ku Klux Klan, or it could be somebody who is unrealizing, not really in the realization that what they're saying is segregationist. So, for example, and to put it into modern day terms or simplistic terms, this could be somebody as simple as saying, well, that's a black neighborhood. That's a white neighborhood. Oh, that's a white school. That's a black school. That's a segregationist mentality that you're kind of identifying an area or an organization or something as being just for one race. And it can be any race. It doesn't have to be, that's where the Asians live. That's where the Jews live. It can, that's kind of what he's talking about. Is there are people, if you're so comfortable in just labeling something, even if you don't view yourself, because many segregationists would not categorize themselves as being racist. They would kind of shun, and that's not what I meant, or that's not who I am, or whatever else. So all these people that are getting caught saying things now on camera and saying, well, that's not really who I am as a person. Kendi's going to say, yes, it is, because you're not unlearning those things. You're saying them without really realizing and focusing on that they have consequences. Now, an assimilationist is somebody that just tolerates the mixture of blacks and whites, Asians, Latinos, whoever. Okay. And so an assimilationist is kind of like somebody that might say, and this is kind of an assimilationist mentality, well, it'd be really nice if people would just learn the language. Okay. Well, what language? Are we talking about English? And it's kind of a backhanded thing that if all of us could learn the same language, we'd be fine. That's an assimilationist type mentality that Kendi would be going for, is that you don't realize that you're actually being very exclusive and you're actually being very closed off, where, okay, well, if they don't speak your language, well, then obviously you just dismiss them. That's not really an open and accepting thing. Whereas an assimilationist would also not have a problem living in a neighborhood of a multicultural neighborhood, but they would still have maybe some things where it's like, well, we need to have some common ground that's almost forced. Okay. The anti-racist is the person that stands up and refuses, and this is kind of a distinction in his larger book. He's not saying that an anti-racist doesn't see race. There's always somebody that pops on and say, well, I don't see race, like I don't see color. That's not what an anti-racist is. An anti-racist is somebody that sticks up for people who have been hurt because of their color, their race, because of prejudicial thought. So Kendi's kind of saying, like, an anti-racist is somebody that is actively trying to make the world more inclusive, actually trying to bring people together, actually trying to understand the differences and celebrate them. So that's kind of where he's coming from. Now, keep in mind where he's writing this book from. He's writing it from the standpoint of somebody that has been watching young African-American males and females, for that matter, being killed by police. Okay. And so he kind of puts it in there that, the statistics he's providing are from 2010 to 2012. So he's talking about in a 2-year time span, when he's writing Stamped from the Beginning, and now it's being kind of processed into this book. He's writing it when Trayvon Martin is killed, and Trayvon Martin is not killed. This is an important distinction. He's not killed by a police officer. He's killed by a glorified neighborhood watchman. Okay. Somebody that really should have never had a gun in the first place, should have never been confronting Trayvon Martin. And this was kind of what started the trend here, unfortunately. And it's been a trend that, and when I say trend, this has been a problem before Trayvon Martin, but the trend in the media of kind of blowing it up and making it a vignette of, here is a larger problem, which is important that they're doing that. But if you asked African American males back in the 80s and 90s, they would have said this is a problem too. So this is not a problem that's new. This is a problem that has been in existence for quite some time. And now it's just starting to get talked about, which is why it's important. And Kendi kind of points out, hey, these trends here for that 2-year time period, because I've heard people argue this where it's a 2-year time period and he's saying, oh, you're 5 times more likely to be incarcerated if you're African American. You're 21 times more likely to get shot by police. And somebody will say, well, that's just over a 2-year time period. Well, that's a 2-year time period that the news was reporting on, and it was still happening. You know, the news was actually saying, here's what happened in Tulsa. Here's what happened in Minneapolis. Here's what happened in Atlanta. And they were kind of pointing out that these things, these instances were happening, and yet they were still happening 21 times more likely one way. So Kendi's kind of saying, look, I'm not just quoting a statistic. I'm pointing out that this is when we were reporting it, and it's still that skewed. You know, and the argument would be, if it's on the news, wouldn't you think that the police would say, oh, hey, there is a problem and we need to fix it? Over 2 years, there was no fix to that problem, which is kind of why he's writing this. Okay. So kind of keep that in mind as well. And he also kind of, and one of the quotes that I'm going to kind of read out on the introduction is, I found that the need of powerful people to defend racist policies that benefited them led them to produce racist ideas. And when unsuspecting people consumed these racist ideas, they became ignorant and hateful. He makes it very clear that racist ideas are not what starts the process. It's a use of power from somebody to teach you racist ideas so that it can then be used to create racism. Okay, and it was interesting in his larger book, Stand from the Beginning, he does make great pains to talk about the Klan was born not from racist mentality per se. It was born as a way of teaching racist mentality, to normalize it, to make it okay. Okay, so you've got competing I guess, educational groups, if you will. And he's kind of saying leaders will take this and utilize that kind of rhetoric, that kind of speech, to then teach their followers that they're not wrong to feel the way that they feel. Okay. And this happens all across. Misunderstanding can happen in the easiest way because you get a little bit of emotion involved and you can teach a concept that is hurtful towards other people. And sadly, that's kind of where Kendi's coming from here. Is he's saying, look, leaders have been using this type of rhetoric for years to gain followers, to gain, people that will kind of do, and people will do crazy things. And I only need to point out January 6th. January 6th, that was not a typical crowd of Americans. These were people that had been fed lies. These are people that had been fed a pile of garbage, basically, by some of the people. And look, we're going to have an impeachment trial here coming up of the president, the former president now. And the reason they're holding him accountable to this is because he was one of the people feeding out this lie. And it was a lie. The votes were certified. The votes were checked and rechecked, recounted. Everything was certified. Now, you can believe that there were some small little problems here and there. You can certainly believe in your heart of hearts that there was voter fraud, but there's no evidence. Okay, I'm not trying to be political, really. I'm just telling you, as a social studies teacher, there's no evidence. They didn't present any evidence. And because of that, you had followers of this group who stormed the Capitol building. And every one of those people should go to jail because that is a crime. What they did is a crime. Now, why do I bring that up? There was a normalizing of that online right afterwards that Kendi would immediately point and say, that is segregationist thought. That is assimilationist thought. And the thought was, oh, well, it was okay for Black Lives Matter to burn and to destroy and to... No, nobody was saying it was okay. But there is a difference in, and it's not okay either way, but there's a difference between going in and raiding a Target and stealing things from Target, which if you watch the video footage, these were not Black Lives Matter protesters that were running in and stealing things from Target. These were people in the local neighborhood who saw an opportunity and took it. Okay. At the same time, all the people that raided the Capitol building, is that indicative of all white conservatives? No. The vast majority of white conservatives were just as shocked watching the TV news as anybody else. That group of people committed a crime. So too did the people who raided the Target or burned down the building in Minneapolis or lit fires during protests that went a little too far, you know, but normalizing it and saying somehow that, oh, well, they're the same thing. They are not the same thing. Raiding a Target and raiding a government building and threatening our elected officials, completely different levels of crazy. Okay, completely different levels. And that's kind of what Kenny's trying to point out is you can't just normalize it. Leaders can't come along and say, oh, well, they burned a building in Minneapolis, so therefore raiding the Capitol building is the same thing. It's not. Okay, so that's kind of where Kenny's coming from, is that anytime that there is some sort of lawlessness and it's predominantly white, it's excused, and when it's black, it's expected. And that, again, if you and I strongly advise you, if not this year, but sometime in your life, to read his original book, because it's fascinating. Stamped is good, but it's kind of a survey. Stamped from the beginning, it tells you kind of the whole thing. And I posted it on Google Classroom so that you guys can you know, read it. There's the actual PDF of it, but there's also an audio book too, for those of you that aren't really the strongest readers or really have a hard time kind of keeping up with it. It's there for you. And again, I'm not going to assign it, but it's there for you for your own educational purposes if you're truly interested in learning about this. All right. So that's kind of the purpose. The main thing to get out of this is, and the tenor of the book is going to be kind of pointing out that American history has three groups. And again, to repeat that there are segregationists who want to separate. There are assimilationists who are okay with the mixture, but only to a certain point. And there are anti-racists who want our culture to come together and want the history to be taught from a more wide perspective, to be more inclusive across the board. That's kind of his point of writing the original book, and then of course writing this as well, and allowing Reynolds to kind of collaborate. So that being said, I want to make sure that before we leave here, I make sure to tell you what the expectations are moving forward. You will notice on week 2, January 27th, which is today through next Tuesday, there are 2 assignments. One is to read chapter 1. Okay, chapter 1 is posted. It was just posted a few minutes ago. You have to read chapter 1, because the next week's assignment will be totally based on that, and you'll need to have that read for that. There is also a Flipgrid assignment in the introduction. Kendi talks about influence. He never really looked, and he said, I held racist ideas myself until I started to look at my influences. So what he was talking about is, who are your literary influences? Who do you read when you're kind of like, hey, I need to learn, I need to understand, I need to, get in touch with the country or myself, or, my family situation or whatever else. Who's your influence when it comes to literature? Okay. And this could be anything from actual big books to newspaper articles to, hey, I follow somebody's blog, or I, go to a YouTube feed of somebody that's kind of feeding me information, or, who do you classify as your influence there, or artistic, if there's an artistic or musical influence. I really want you to think this week, what are my influences? Who kind of influences my worldview? Okay. And I'm not talking about your family members, even though they do. Absolutely, they do. And I'm not talking about your teachers, because many of them do. And I'm not talking about even your friends at this point. I'm talking about, if you need to understand kind of who you are as a person, the world situation, if you need to understand kind of how you fit, who you turn into, who is influencing your growth of thought, of opinion. Is it a musical artist? Is it a poet? Is it, hey, I read a book that just kind of blew me away. So there's a Flipgrid assignment where I want you to kind of think about and then record you explaining who your influence or influences are, to shape your worldview. Okay, that's kind of the assignment for next week. And again, the other part of the assignment is for reading chapter 1. Now, before we leave here, I want to make sure, I know a lot of you were kind of jumping on late. There will be no online meeting next weekend, or next week on Wednesday. I have to take my oldest daughter to her dentist appointment. So you are not going to have a Zoom meeting next week. Now I will still record a lesson, and have, obviously assignments for the next week. But the lesson will be on Stamped Chapter 1. So please make sure that you have that read, and then you can kind of watch it whenever you want. You watch it during this time period. I'll have it posted by this time period so that you can use, that remote time period to get your work done for this class, but it'll also be posted throughout the week, and you can do it whenever, for those of you that like to sleep in a little bit. So if you have any questions, if you have any thoughts, comments, or whatever else, you can stay behind. But otherwise, I want to give you plenty of time to get to your next class. So thanks for swinging by, folks, and we'll see you not next week, but the week following.